Thank you. I'm greatly honored to be here post-COVID. It's nice to see people in the third dimension. I've been living with my partner, Dr. Pam Crisco, who just gave a talk in a remote island in northern British Columbia. And COVID had some unexpected benefits that many of us, I think, realize. So it's a time for great self-reflection. We're at a nexus point in the evolution of our species. We face most challenging times. But mushrooms in particular have become the zeitgeist of our time. It's a revolution from the underground occurring all over the planet. So my talk is mycocentric because that's the subject I know. I know mycology, but I applaud the researchers in LSD, MDMA, ketamine, ibogaine. I think all these substances have really important applications. But psilocybin mushrooms are unique. So I want to give you my disclosures. I did start a company at fungi.com. I have 145 employees. I own the entire company myself. I have no debt. I have no partners. I created that company in order to do research. I never chased money. I chased research and funding. And so now I have 10 full-time researchers that are exploring, especially neurogenesis and the tryptamines of psilocybin-related mushrooms and causing improvement in psychomotor skills, cognition, and also treating many mood disorders. I started a new company with my partner, Dr. Pam Crisco, Mycomedical Life Sciences. None of you probably have heard about us. We've been in stealth mode. We've raised $60 million, and we plan clinical studies based on our research coming up. I've written numerous books, 7 of them, and I have another book that I'm finishing now that'll be out this time next year on psilocybin, the field guide to psilocybin mushrooms of the world. So I don't know the difference between my avocation and my vocation. We all have a bias. Every professor here who is tenured has a bias because it's published or perished. So we cannot separate our avocations from our vocations. If you're truly interested in the subject, you're motivated to explore. So nevertheless, those are my disclosures. So this is extraordinary. 5,682 specimens or collections since the 1800s, 141 species that are psilocybin active have identified around the planet, and every continent except for Antarctica. Now, this is very different than peyote, which I am personally opposed to the legalization of peyote because it needs to be protected for the peyote people, the Yaquis and the Huichols and other indigenous people of that region of Mexico and Southwest Texas. But psilocybin mushrooms are different. They're sustainable. We can cultivate them. They're all saprophytic. These are decomposers. They're easily scalable. So I'm going to take you first some of the history. Most of you know this, but I want to carry you through the recent past and then our current research. So there's many glimpses, echoes in the archaeological record that gives us suggestions of psilocybin mushroom use. But it's really the artists that have preserved some of this knowledge, because the oral languages from subjugation, from domination, from invasion of cultures, from religious persecution, from military superior invaders, they oftentimes look at the spoken word elders and they basically exterminate them. It's amazing we are here today. We are all carrying the torch forward of our ancestors throughout the world. We all are knowledge keepers. And we now hold this precious knowledge that's been so tenuously protected and transmitted over time. How many threads of knowledge have been clipped? You think about the library at Alexandria, more than 1 million texts, and that library was burned. How much ancestral knowledge on psychedelics was in the library of Alexandria? We will never know. But we are here, and this is our time. We are here at a time that we all can make a difference as knowledge keepers, preserving this thread and then expanding the web of the wisdom that we've gained from psychedelics. So it's extraordinary. Many of you know about the Eleusinian mysteries, but what dawned on me that was so amazing, the Eleusinian mysteries went on for 1,500 to almost 2,000 years. But in Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries were co-occurring at the same time the Mesoamerican mushroom stones were being made in Guatemala that also survived for more than a millennia. So on 2 different sides of the planet, there seems to be these centers of use of sacraments, specifically fungi, and moreover, mushrooms. So we do have some written record from the Catholic priest Sayogun, who recorded the use of psilocybin mushrooms of the Aztecs. And this is an extraordinary statement. They ate the mushrooms before dawn with honey. Well, that's interesting, because in the previous slide, you saw the Sicilian Anjar cave art, where the bee man is adorned with mushrooms. It's well known through many indigenous cultures because mushrooms are so perishable that you can preserve them in honey. Now, why are mushrooms so unique in many ways? In your horizon of your experiences, you encounter plants, animals, other substances commonly. You have a long-term exposure to them, days, weeks, months, years. But mushrooms come up and they disappear in 5 days. What were they? They're ephemeral. And because they're so ephemeral, some mushrooms can feed you, some can kill you, some can heal you, some can send you on a spiritual journey. To have a sacrament that is so powerful, but yet so ephemeral, the knowledge keepers within these communities were preciously few. They were a subset of the shamans. So the Bavarian Beer Act in 1516 in Germany, which now known as Germany, they specifically banned mushrooms from beer. I believe this is a evidence, albeit circumstantial, because we don't have really good records, but psilocybin mushrooms being preserved in honey led to psychoactive meads. And my Germanic ancestors, and many of you of European ancestry, the average lifespan in 1516 was 30 to 35 years of age. That is the time that if your mate died, it's time to recouple, to find, to build a new family. Because with a husband, with a wife, with another partner, you have a better chance of survival and for your children. So this is really amazing to me that throughout the world, we have, different echoes from the past that suggest the use of these sacred substances. Now, we have to give tribute to Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina, Mazatec shaman, she graciously opened up the mystery of psilocybin mushrooms to the Wassons, Argorden, and Valentina Wasson. But Valentina Wasson did not get enough credit. She was a Russian doctor. She knew mushrooms by their Latin binomials. She taught Argorden Wasson about the love of mushrooms. They coined mycophilia from her Russian background, loving mushrooms, and mycophobia from his English background, where they had a fear of mushrooms. But both Maria Sabina and Tina Wasson were mycologists. Maria Sabina was not just a shaman, and also Tina Wasson was not just a physician. They were mycologists. They went out into the fields, into the woods. They could identify mushrooms and know which ones were sacred, know which ones were edible, know which ones were poisonous. This is the different level of knowledge, a next level of knowledge than just taking a pill in a hospital of a white powder. When you're engaged in the journey of seeking and understanding and corporeally engaging these sacred substances, it deepens your experience because psilocybin mushrooms brings you greater contact with the earth, with the ecosystem, to become better earth citizens, to protect the very environments that give us sustainability. I hear our ancestors calling out to us. I hear our descendants calling back in time, asking us to wake up. We have such an influence on the course of human history. What is our responsibility? And I think this is what these sacred substances teach us. So, when I was 14 years old, my brother John came back from Yale. He brought one of his textbooks, Altered States of Consciousness. I adored my older brother. We had a complete laboratory in the basement. We actually had the main radio from the aircraft carrier, the Intrepid. During World War II, my father served on the Intrepid. So my brother John would park me in the corner. I listened to coded messages behind the Iron Curtain. He was a serious chemist, 3 rows of chemicals, and then he's doing experiments. And then he went off to Yale, and I had the laboratory to myself. Every experiment, danger, do not bring near a flame. That was my. I wanted to build rockets, and then exploded the laboratory once, but that's a different story. So John lent me this book, and I lent it to my friend Ryan, who's my best friend. He borrowed it. And then John had to go back, and I kept on asking my friend Ryan to return my book. And he kept on avoiding the issue, and I kept on asking him. And finally, I said, Ryan, my brother needs the book. He's going back now. And Ryan sheepishly looked at me and said, I can't give you your book back. I said, why? He says, my father found it and burned it. I said, your father burned my brother's book? Whoa. I was so ashamed to tell my brother what had happened. But I thought of my friend's father, who's an authoritarian figure, was so threatened by this book he had to burn it, that I think I found my cause in life. So I published my first book on psilocybin mushrooms 45 years ago, Psilocybe mushrooms and their allies. This is how much I've been embedded into the subject. When I first attended mycological conferences, it was like I was a leper, a disease. I had a contagion. I go into the conferences, there'd be a force field of isolation form around me, wherever I had walked. But thankfully, I had some great teachers. This is my brother John, I mentioned, my father, who was a scientist and an engineer, my mother, who was a spiritual leader, who taught me the importance of kindness. These three individuals in my family most influenced me, and these mycologists did. Dr. Daniel Stuntz, Kit Skates, Dr. Michael Bugh, and Dr. Alexander Smith, who wrote a monograph on the genus Psilocybe. Stuntzii is named after Daniel Stuntz. Michael Bugh is still alive, and Kit Skates was a force of nature. Dr. Andrew Weil, who published in the Harvard Botanical Leaflets in the 1970s, a phenomenon that psilocybin mushrooms were attracting huge amounts of young people when they realized they didn't have to go to Mexico and Oaxaca. These psilocybin mushrooms grew in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia primarily. So numerous books were published. Terrence and I became best friends. Terrence's book on the right, Psilocybin Mushroom Grower's Guide, was by far the most popular book that then taught people how to grow psilocybin mushrooms, primarily Psilocybe cubensis, in their closets, their basements, in the universities. I called the Psilocybin Mushroom Scholarship Fund. Many people here funded their university education through growing psilocybes. Names will not be mentioned. And then we started doing a series of conferences. And Jonathan Ott is a feature over there on the right, Dr. Gaston Guzman, Jeremy Boogwood, myself, Jim Jacobs, and Stephen Pollack. So that was in 1979. And this conference today is a continuity of that knowledge, that we're sharing information. It's extraordinary that we have this history and we have all these experts now that are this new generation that's rising up. The conferences continue also here in the UK and in Europe. And there's from the Psychoactive Mushroom Conference or Psychoactivity Conference in 1998, there's Albert Hofmann, Sasha and Ann Shulgin, myself, and other people that I'm sure some of you recognize. I am a married prankster. I knew Ken Kesey well. You know, those of you who read the electric acid colloid test, or sometimes A Great Notion. You know, this is the beginning of the Beat generation. And I knew the psychedelic scientists, and I also knew the cultural psychedelic, heroes of the time. That Venn intersection, I thought, this is great. I'll bring them all together at this extraordinary mushroom conference in 1999, the Millennium Mushroom Conference. It was a massive party. I lost control of the conference. But I do want to say something serious here. My father, at the end of his life, asked me to trip with him on psilocybin mushrooms. Dr. Alexander Smith, at the end of his life, who wrote a monograph and published many new species of psilocybin mushrooms, asked me to trip with him. Two hugely important male figures in my life. And I both asked them the same question. Will your partner, in this case their wives, Helen Smith, Mona Stamets, will you also journey with your husbands with me? Both of them said no. I turned down my father. I turned down Dr. Alexander Smith, the father of American mycology. Why? Because I've adopted a long time ago, nature provides, I don't. I think these are sacred, powerful, therapeutic medicines. If I've had this amazing journey with them at the end of their lives, and then the next day I leave, I have no therapeutic support for them. How are they going to explain to their partner the revelatory experience that they have gone through that could challenge their very basis of their life? So I want to applaud all the researchers who have emphasized therapy post the experience. The integration of the experience is so important for maximizing benefit. So I've published 4 new species. Psilocybe azurescens, putatively the most potent psilocybe mushroom in the world, Wiley-eyed centrofibulosus, and fibulosa and linoformans, which is now on the red list here in the UK. I am super honored. Last month, a species was named after me, Psilocybe stametsii. This guy has such a great ring to it. Stametsii, say it with gusto. Different than Alzheimer's and Parkinson's in the field of medicine, you can name a disease after yourself. In the field of mycology, that's bestowed you by somebody else. So note to self. So psilocybe mushrooms are very easy to grow. That's 5 days growing out of Psilocybe cubensis. You can make spores, you can culture from spores or tissue. You can make spore prints very readily. The psilocybin mushrooms, typically in the genus Psilocybe, have purple-brown spores. And the mycelium has a flow of nuclei. And because of the network-like design of mycelium, epigenesis occurs at the tips. So these are designed to be self-learning membranes that can adapt to catastrophia. Uniquely, the majority of psilocybin mushrooms that grow on wood are associated with human activity of chipping wood. They're resident in the forest, oftentimes hidden until wood is chipped, houses are built, fires are made. It's the path of the debris fields that we create that these psilocybin mushrooms seem to be chasing behind us. Psilocybe cubensis is by far the most commonly cultivated psilocybin mushroom in the world. It appears that it came out of Africa. There's no doubt that we all migrated from Africa. I don't think anyone credible can challenge that notion anymore. And Psilocybe cubensis migrated also with humans. Recently, my friend Juliana Furshi from Chile, the head of the Fungi Foundation, went to Oaxaca and visited Maria Sabina's family. And the mathetex there, because of the interest in psilocybin mushrooms, is so phenomenally high right now, they can't collect the Psilocybe cereulescens and Zapaticorum and Mexicana, the 3 species they use, because it's out of season compared to the interest of people coming. So which species are they using now? Cultivated Psilocybe cubensis, using Western in vitro technology to create a sustainable psilocybin source so they can continue their shamanic practices. This is the way of panspermia. Species migrate with humans. Psilocybe cubensis colonized the Americas with the advent and bringing in of cattle. Now that's interesting because it goes in multiple directions. Now here's Psilocybe cubensis, and this is important for you to know, collecting them when the veils are closed. It maximizes potency, minimizes potential adverse effects. I developed this technique you see on the left. That's one flush. Uniform fruit bodies, 1/3 of the dried mass of the substrate became dried mass of mushrooms. This is really important for quality control because sporulation is a problem. Once the mushrooms sporulate, they rot. Mushrooms do not have a good immune system. The mycelium does. It's resident for weeks, months, years. The mycelium produces mushrooms that are fragile. They quickly decompose, especially after sporulation. And the thick of the flesh thins and the gills extend, and the spores don't contain psilocybin. So there's an illusion that bigger is better. It's not true. These tight-capped young fruit bodies are equally or greater mass than the loosely less dense, larger fruit bodies that are sporulating. 100% of asthmatic children tested were allergic to Psilocybe cubensis spores. 100%. I have a dear friend whose wife died in his arms this past year from an asthmatic attack. This is serious to minimize adverse events. Very few people understand this. You need to consume these mushrooms when they're closed capped and they lack sporulation because adverse events can occur. Asthmatic children can become asthmatic adults. Allergies can actually compound in age. So psilocybe cyanescens was first identified and published by Elsie Wakefield from the Kew Gardens here. It looks like, very plausibly, psilocybe cyanescens colonized Europe because the Kew Gardens bring in all these plants. So this panspermia of psilocybin mushrooms, migratory, goes both ways. It is the way of these psilocybin mushrooms to follow human activity. So I'm going to show 4 little short videos here because many of you may not have collected psilocybe cyanescens. It grows here in the UK. And, whoops, let's try that again. Oh, my movie is not moving. Okay, the AV people might have to help me on this. I'll try it again. I am frozen. Anybody up in the AV can help me? Try it again. Negatory. If you could just advance to the next slide, that would be helpful. Oh. Houston, do you copy? Unfortunately, I can't hear a word you're saying, so. What's that? 1 second? All right. I'm not going to tell any mushroom jokes. I've heard every mushroom joke in the world. So psilocybe cyanescens is called the wavy cap. It's a ligniculus, which means it grows on wood. We've never found psilocybe
throughout the temperate.
With it. Pardon? Okay. All right. Now we go back. Okay, here we go. Hopefully this works. Ow. Yes. So this is a naturalized patch of, whoops, stopped again. All right. This is a naturalized patch of psilocybe cyanescens. What that means is, and what my book, Mycelium Running, describes, and my new book describes in detail, is these ligniculus wood-decomposing psilocybin mushrooms. When you harvest them, they have rhizomorphs at the base of the stem. Curiously, you can clip the base of the stem and you can plant the stem bases into more wood chips. It metamorphosizes into mycelium. The caps won't. They'll rot with bacteria and fungi and other organisms. But the stems have this ability of rebirth, rejuvenation. That's extraordinary. So for the myconauts out there collecting these species, whether it's Psilocybe cerevisica, cyanescens, azurescens, you can then collect the mushrooms and transplant those stem butts directly in to a patch of wood chips and get it to grow. Now, the psilocybe mushrooms, in this case, Psilocybe azurescens, the most potent ones produce a bluing reaction upon staining. Psilocybin is a prodrug for psilocin. And then psilocin, when it's decomposed by enzymes, produce the compounds which have this blue pigment. So the bluing reaction, the stronger it is, the more potent the mushrooms once were. So, well, hopefully this movie will go. So this is an extraordinary patch of Psilocybe azurescens.
Greetings, and meet Psilocybe azurescens. Psilocybe azurescens is probably one of the most potent mushrooms in the world. It contains psilocybin and psilocin up to 2% of its dried mass. Think of that. 2% of the dried mass of this mushroom are psychoactive crystals. Why would a mushroom produce so much? We don't know, but it certainly has attracted the interest of humans. The bluing that you see here is a bruising reaction. It's indicative of psilocin as it degrades. And the more bluing you see, the more psilocin there once was. Now, psilocybin dephosphorylates into psilocin, and when you ingest these mushrooms, psilocin becomes a serotonin agonist. It means that the psilocybin or the psilocin becomes a temporary neurotransmitter, opening up the floodgates of the senses. Now, this mushroom is sinuous. It's got a sinuous stem, which means it bends back and forth. It's bluing very, very strongly, and it has these very indicative spore color here on the annular zone. And the spore color is purple-brown, and the mushrooms are bluish. Those two features in combination pretty much de facto determines its psilocybe. Now look how bodacious the rhizomorphs are at the base of the stem. This is a large psilocybe, by far the largest one that I know that grows on wood chips in the Pacific Northwest. It is now a popular one to have in your backyard. It's just fun. It's just naturalized in the woods here. And this is a beautiful fruiting of them. And the psilocybes, many of the woodland psilocybes have this chestnut brown to caramel color. This one is unique in that it's got these umbos, and it's a broad umbo, and the cap is very circular. The bruising reactions just from impact of rain, perhaps. This mushroom is one of the most fascinating and interesting ones to grow. Those who choose to partake of this mushroom should be warned. These are exceptionally potent, and oftentimes they can cause temporary paralysis, loss of muscle control. So that is not a good thing. It seems that most people who boil this mushroom in hot water, those symptoms seem to be alleviated. But this is clearly a sacred species, and I love just personally touching it. This is not a mushroom that I enjoy eating. It's almost too potent for me. And but it is a species that I greatly admire. I love touching it. I love handling it. I love seeing it. And it's a great indicator of the habitat in my magical mushroom forest that is very conducive to spiritual experiences.
So those stem buds you can clip and you can plant them into new wood chips. So you can actually transplant wild mushrooms to grow in your backyard. Now, Psilocybe folliculosa also is very common in the Pacific Northwest. It's the only species I've truly found in a native habitat, an old-growth forest that's undisturbed. All the other psilocybe mushrooms are associated with human activity and grasslands, cattle, sheep, and the woods are associated with wood chips. So they're resident in the ecosystem, but they're hidden, probably as endophytes inside of many trees. So concurrently with psilocybes, you have the most deadly poisonous mushroom in the world, Galerina marginata. Similar to Amanita phalloides, verosa, bisporgera, this contains the potent alpha amatoxins that can kill you within a few days. So this is actually an indicator species, Galerina marginata, that tells me it's the right habitat for psilocybin mushrooms. But you have to be very careful. Spore color makes the biggest difference in identifying psilocybin mushrooms. They have purple-brown spores. Galerinas and many of these poisonous species do not have purple-brown spores, in this case, rusty brown. Folliculosa co-occurs with marginata, so does Psilocybe stametsii. So Psilocybe semilanceata, liberty caps, well known here in the UK. So we're going to go on a little mushroom foray for liberty caps.
Throughout the temperate regions of Europe and the Pacific Northwest, one of the most interesting psilocybes to collect is one that grows near ponds in the grass. And this field has not had cows on it for more than 10 years. So cows and sheep can help, but they're not necessary. And this is Psilocybe semilanceata, the famed liberty cap. It's exquisite little fruiting here. It's got a translucent striate margin. You can see striations. They're actually the gills showing through the cap. And the cap also has a separable gelatinous pellicle. So here is one over here we can look at. And as you tear the cap, there is a film that's clearly visible. And you can say, whoa, that's a really big one. And that film stretches and breaks. So these mushrooms have purple-brown spores, a separable gelatinous pellicle, and they typically have a sharp umbo or a nipple at the very, very top of the cap. And this papilla or nipple is not always in every specimen, but it's quite characteristic of the species in general. So Psilocybe semilanceata. Many people, when they pick semilanceata, they don't realize that the stem is so long. I think it's a mutualistic species with the rhizomes of grass, almost like a pseudo-mycorrhizal relationship, which means it's not obligatory, but it benefits from it. And the stems often are picked because people don't realize that the stem length goes way, way down. So be careful. Always try to get the base of the stem if you can.
So it appears that Psilocybe semilanciata also colonized the Americas from Europe when grasses were brought over to feed, the sheep and cattle. Psilocybe semilanciata is packed full of psilocybin, very little psilocin, so it does not typically bruise bluish. So that combination of bluing and purple-brown spores does not really apply to this species. This is just friggin' bizarre.
We shows on both. Okay, this is July 2011, and it's just hard to believe that Paul Stamets' boat will be growing a psychoactive mushroom, but it's true. I know it's not the best specimen right now, but this is Gymnopolis luteofolius. It is unique to alder. It's a very rare species. In fact, most mycologists would not be able to identify it. I just happen to have a specialty in this area, and it is. It's so weird because my friend Clay here, hey Clay, he said he found a mushroom going off of a boat and he brought it to me from your friend, right?
Harstein Island boat launch.
And it was also Gymnopolis luteofolius. So it begs the question now, is this mushroom indigenous to Northwest boats? And I've never found this in the wild. I've seen it at a mycological society, but I go figure. Now, I'm not going to pick it, so I guess I'm not breaking the law. Or am I breaking the law because it's growing here? I know what it is. I don't know what to do. How bizarre. Gymnopolis luteofolius on Stamets' boat, and we've had more than one sighting of this on this boat, and more than one boat now, 2 boats. So go figure.
Now, let's think about the bigger picture here. You have drift logs, but you also had ships, right, from Europe coming to the Americas. Many of these ships were rotting for the mycelium, and many of the settlers then would break down the ships to build houses. So there became mycelial footprints. So I think that's amazing. Now, I'm happy to announce this past month, I received my Drug Enforcement Administration license for psilocybin. And so I have a lot of fun with the DEA because their policies are totally out of sync with reality. And I pose questions like this, and they were dumbfounded because they're not taxonomous. And their great quote is, "Paul, we know shit about psilocybin mushrooms," a quote from the DEA. And so we have written a white paper now that hopefully will begin policy changes within the DEA. It's not reasonable for anyone in this room to know what Gymnopolis luteofolius looks like. Really? I mean, if you can't identify an illegal substance, why does the government place penalties on you for something that you cannot possibly identify? It's not reasonable. Okay, so let's march forward. There's now more states now, but there are 26 states that have ballots or initiatives or bills in process. Of course, many of you know about Oregon and Colorado. They're now legal in Jamaica, the Bahamas. Canadians are highly in favor of the legalization for the therapeutic use of psilocybin. Canada is really leading the way, as well as Australia. So I want to look at some meta-studies. Now, meta-studies can inform clinicians on how to design clinical studies. So association is not causation, but it can be, and it can be a mixture of both. But this is extraordinary. 485,000 inmates over 13 years survey. And if there was, they used psychedelics, it was particularly psilocybin, there was statistically significant decrease in criminal behavior. Now, LSD also had a correlation, but no other psychedelic. So this is amazing, is that psilocybin, LSD use reduces crime. Then if you look at intimate partner-to-partner violence, and looking at this survey of 1,266 people, the only LSD and psilocybin were associated with a reduction in partner-to-partner violence. Then we look at another survey between psychedelic use and opioid use in the United States. 214,000 people in this survey, and psilocybin was the only psychedelic that was associated with a reduction in opioid use disorder. This is extraordinary. And then when you're looking at this observational study that was just published on Nature Relatedness, only past use of psilocybin versus LSD, mescaline, salvia, ketamine, ibogaine, was a reliable predictor of nature relatedness in a subdimension. Psilocybin stands unique. LSD is closely behind. Psilocybin reduces crime. Psilocybin, I believe, reduces partner-to-partner violence. All of us who are psilocybin myconauts know that the experience from psilocybin makes you more inspired to protect the ecosystem, that you are tied into the ecosystem and you hear the voices of nature calling out to you to do your job, to protect the environment for the future descendants and for biodiversity. I believe psilocybin makes nicer people. And moreover, should the government officials be listening, and I hope that you are, psilocybin reduces crime and makes more law-abiding citizens. What is the return on the investment in the use of psychedelics and psilocybin and LSD in reducing crime? And think of the money that is saved. My family has been deeply affected by opioid use disorder. I don't want to talk about it. It's hard to talk about it. You don't want to share bad news. But the difference of psilocybin is like a pebble in a pond. When people use psilocybin, they have this experience in breaking opioid or breaking tobacco use or becoming more gentler, kinder people. You want to talk about it. Like pebbles in a pond, it emanates out, it ripples through society. And now, rather not wanting to talk to your neighbors, your family about opioid use disorder of a family friend, you want to carry good news. And that ripple effect expands. All of us are part of that. I think psilocybin is paradigm shifting to be able to help societies across the world to reduce the threat of war, terrorism, social injustice, sexual prejudices. This is our time, folks. Now, we have a problem with psilocybin. It's the too good to be true adage. And hey, I agree. I agree with that. But I also like to make a little footnote. There's always exceptions to the rules. So let's see what the clinical trials bear out. 120 universities, clinicaltrials.gov. You can look this up. I think it's 125 now. This is the past week. That are doing clinical studies with psilocybin. They went through IRB boards. 11 of these are using niacin as an active placebo. I'll get back to that. This is the problem with clinical trials trying to create a placebo have an inherent problem here. And I pose also to the clinicians, you're designing a clinical trial using psilocybin to treat depression. Aren't you exacerbating that depression because these people are desperate for a cure and they get the placebo? And then you do your contrast of the benefits versus the placebo group. Aren't you actually exacerbating the differences? And what's the ethical responsibility that you bear? Now, some people say they'll switch it out, they'll open it, etc. Yeah, but you traumatize people. They were hoping to get the medicine. Moreover, niacin flush happens in 15 or 20 minutes. All of you have done niacin, you know, you itchy, you get hot. You know very quickly you got the placebo, and it's no longer a double-blind placebo study, right? Fundamentally flawed at its inception. So we need a better model. And the open model may be the best model. I don't have an answer for the best model. So there are numerous double-blind clinical studies. All of you know about this, so I'll just go through these quickly. The one that Amanda Fielding, thank you, Amanda, for spearheading this, at Johns Hopkins, but 87% of the people from psilocybin, a small one, rated it as the most significant of their lives, and 67% were abstinent 1 year later from one of the most addictive substances in time known. And then we have it with heavy drinking and binge drinking. And then we also have this proposal by Johns Hopkins to reschedule Psilocybin from Schedule 1 to Schedule 4. So the tides are changing. We're all are part of this movement. We need to let the science lead. And so I want all critics here to be circumspect and be careful about throwing other researchers under the bus or other research studies. We're at the very beginning of this process. Many of the conventional ideas that we have today will look rather archaic in the future. So we have to be very careful about shepherding this knowledge to have science prove what many of these meta studies are showing. So I want to talk about microdosing. So microdosing basically is non-intoxicating. I don't say subsensorium anymore or perceptual, because microdosing, which is usually 1/10 of a gram of Psilocybe cubensis, 1 gram is 10 milligrams of psilocybin at 1%. 1/10 of a gram is 1 milligram. But 1 gram is a liftoff dose. Most of you know that. But the idea is subperceptual. I don't like, because when I microdose, color's a little brighter. My partner says I'm nicer. I tend to be just a happier person. To me, I'm perceiving it. But it's non-intoxicating. So I define microdosing as non-intoxicating. Macrodosing as intoxicating and perceptual. So we did this meta study through microdose.me. It's an app you can download, quantified citizen. We have over 24,000 people currently enrolled. We published this in Nature Scientific Reports. 88% of the people were taking 1/10 to 1/3 of a gram of Psilocybe cubensis. So important to note that. So this is basically in the non-intoxicating range. So the app uses vetted psychiatric tests for depression, anxiety, etc. And it then collates these. It's gone through ethics review. You own your own data. And we have expanded this to LSD, MDMA. We ask what you're microdosing, how much you're taking, what are you using as an admixture. I mentioned lion's mane and niacin on Joe Rogan. Got a lot of attention. So we have a lot of people using this combination of lion's mane, niacin, and psilocybin. Memory challenge tests, numerous tests that are commonly used in psychiatry. Also, cognition challenges, auditory, etc. So we published 2 papers in Nature about a year apart. The peer reviewers were so impressed because the data sets were so large. And then we went, and since this was an observational study, prospective retroactive observational study, we had motivations for people taking the microdoses, people challenged with mental health. Their primary motivations were depression and anxiety resolution. People who were not challenged with mental health issues, their prime motivations was cognition and agility. That's interesting. So in this group, the number of people who stacked, 3,486 people were stacking, and the majority of people stacked, 55% of the people were stacking, and this subset, 28% of the people were using the Stamets stack, which is the combination that I mentioned. So we've got some really significant results against depression and reducing anxiety. Highly significant using the PANAS and DAS scores. But there's a valid criticism of expectancy. So let's put expectancy in perspective. Every one of you who goes to a doctor, you expect the doctor to give you a prescription of a medicine. So expectancy can be a coefficient variable enhancing the therapeutic consequence of a validated medicine. So the two go together. So separating expectancy from a medicine is extremely difficult to do. I thank you, David, for your talk, because I think you pointed it out that quite nicely. So I accept this concern. In psychiatry, it's an extremely complicated field of medicine. But if you have patients coming to you who are highly depressed and anxious, and they come back to you after microdosing and they're no longer depressed and anxious, isn't that the goal of your profession? To reduce anxiety and depression? Are you going to argue with the patient saying, no, you should not be less depressed, you should not have less anxiety because it's a placebo? Well, that would be unethical now, wouldn't it? You want to congratulate the patient on their great progress.
Well, psychiatry is incredibly complex. You can have a placebo-enhanced therapeutic effect. The data basically is not in. We don't have good enough studies to disambiguate the two. But the stack here, which I've evolved over time, welcome to take a photograph of it in the next 10 seconds. So it's 25 to 50 milligrams of niacin. It's a flushing form, vitamin B3. And the idea is psilocybin is a vasoconstrictor, niacin is a vasodilator. So I thought in looking at neuropathies, oftentimes the deadening of the fingertips and the toes due to vasoconstriction. So if you have vasodilation, delivering the neurogenic benefits of psilocybin, then you could enhance then resolving neuropathies by having more delivery via blood flow of the active agents inside of these psilocybin mushrooms. So this is used typically 3 to 5 times a week. And we also bundled it with lion's mane because lion's mane is very well studied. I populated a website, mushroomreferences.com, for physicians and researchers. There's no branding. I think it's about 1,000 pages long now. And you can look up all the clinical studies, albeit small, but representative of many of the studies you've heard here today, of lion's mane helping people overcome depression, and in evidence showing it regenerates myelin on the axons of the nerves. So that's also why I bundled it, is a remyelination, vasodilation, and psilocybin for its neurogenic properties. Lion's mane also codes for NGF, nerve growth factors. So when we got the data and our researchers, they called us up, said, we see something and we don't know what to make of it. So we're not going to tell you the results. What? So they attacked the statistical models, 3 different methods, and they saw something, a signal that was truly extraordinary. The tap test is how many times you can tap your 2 fingers in 10 seconds. When you're 18 years of age, you can do it a lot faster when you're 88, obviously. We all suffer from age-related neurodegeneration. So when we looked at the studies and we pulled out the 55-plus-year-olds, we saw something truly extraordinary. With a stack of psilocybin microdosing, 88% at 1/10 to 1/3 of a gram, with niacin and with lion's mane, statistically significant 0.004, 1 chance in 250. This is just random noise. Increasing the tapping ability of psychomotor skills from 48 taps to 68 taps in the 30 days of use. That's a psychomotor benefit that cannot be explained by expectancy or a placebo. This is evidence, albeit a signal that needs to be clinically proven, that this combination could regenerate the nervous system. So when we saw this data, I tasked my scientific team, what is the modality of action? What's the mechanism of action? It's so funny. Sometimes people get lost in the mechanism of action not to see the forest for the trees. I don't think we understood the mechanism of action for aspirin until the 1970s. It was commonly known to suppress pain. Can you imagine that if we didn't know the mechanism of action for aspirin, aspirin would be banned when it had a utilitarian use? I think this is also in a similar sense. So what could explain the TAP test increase in 55-plus-year-olds? Now, obviously, the aging population, you'd have more background to be able to contrast the benefits. So we focused in on MAPK receptors and track A, B, and C, JAK1. And they're stimulated by nerve growth factors and BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factors. So we started doing experiments with Eurofins, which is a preclinical multi-billion-dollar, scientific company that screens drugs prior to them going into clinical trials. And we began to find synergy. So in track 1, psilocin does stimulate, the production of nerve growth factors that binds with these receptors that then stimulate, cross the cell wall into the nucleus and stimulates the nerves to grow. So psilocin and niacin is an expected cumulative additive effect. We found synergy 4.8 times at the microdosing levels of 3 milligrams. We went to 10 milligrams of psilocybin and niacin.
also within the range of the stack. And we found enhanced synergy in stimulating nerve growth factors binding to TrkA receptors. Then we looked at the three of them together, lion's mane, psilocin, and TrkA, at an extremely small amount. And these have no signal whatsoever, no activity that's detectable on psilocin, niacin, and psilocybe and erinacines, one of the components of lion's mane mushroom. But the three of them put together, a new term of art for me: maximum calculable value. When 0 plus 0 plus 0, equals, in this case, 6. This is called the entourage effect of synergy. It's also the gunpowder analogy in the patent office. How can you patent a natural product? Well, there's a 1A exit strategy if you do something similar to gunpowder: charcoal, sulfur, potassium nitrate. You put them together, they're explosive. Individually, they are not. So then, most significantly, is TrkBs. These code for stem cells differentiating into newborn neurons, especially in the hippocampus. Again, we had maximum calculable value. I think niacin is a catalyst, not only for psilocybin, but we have evidence now for LSD and for DMT, and we have it for MDMA. Now, I think that's important to note, because you can use a smaller amount of the psilocybin, and you can be able to maximize neurogenic potential. This is not addressing depression and anxiety. This is addressing the preservation of healthy neurons, the regeneration of neurons that exist, and the neurogenesis of newborn neurons that all leads to neuroplasticity and synaptogenesis. So I'm not showing, because of lack of time, we also are growing human neurons in vitro, and we're also seeing similar synergetic effects. So we have three silos of signals here. We have the TAP test in the microdose.me app. We have the MAPK responses that you see here. And by the way, I have more than 100 of these. I've submitted over 1,000 samples, and I focused in on the elements in the stack, and that turned out to be the most significant. Well, we also looked at norpsilocin and some of the other analogs, the other tryptamines: baeocystin, norbaeocystin, norpsilocin, and rugenicin. We're also seeing synergy of the entourage. Now, this is a fact. 99.9% plus of the ingestion of psilocybin is in psilocybin mushrooms by the populations of this planet. 95%, maybe higher, of the clinical trials are with psilocybin, the molecule. There is a chasm between the two. We have very strong evidence that the entourage effect of these tryptamines are dancing across the receptor fields of the neuroscape, activating multiple nerve receptors to create neurogeneration. And just reading a paper just yesterday, 1.97 milligrams of psilocybin at the 20% occupancy in the 5-HT2A receptor. Well, that's not full occupancy. And then the half-life of psilocybin is 1.8 hours. You put in a half-life calculator, it's almost negligible the next day. Now, those two things are a little bit different, but nevertheless, you can wash these receptors to make them resensitized. So that's the idea for pulse therapy. You take these microdosing amounts, you clear the receptors, you take more. But no clinical studies are looking at the entourage effect of these tryptamines, most of which are legal. So the bottom line hypothesis is niacin is a catalyst. Niacin is also a vasodilator. Lower doses of psilocybin, niacin, and the tryptamines may be beneficial for mental health. And the entourage effect contributes to cognitive enhancement in individuals consuming psilocybin mushrooms and lion's mane and niacin. The psychomotor test is hard to argue against. This is a physical representation, blinded against controls, and people who took psilocybin in any other form did not show an increase in psychomotor ability. Now think about how many people who fall in age. Think about guitar players, pianists. Think about people coding on a computer. If you can increase your digital dexterity, or your psychomotor skills, This is a game changer. So Ben gave a great talk, and I really liked it because he said all these psychedelics lead to this, and if they're having this effect across the entire mood spectrum and mental health spectrum, this truly could be a game changer. What is uniquely different that we're seeing is the neurogenic potential of psilocybin. And because tryptophans become tryptamines, and I challenge, there's some graduate students here. This is a graduate project I'd love for one of you to take up. Look at the great pastoral areas around this campus and the trees. Strip away all of the cellulose, all the lignin, all the hemicellulose, and strip it all away. What would you see? You'd see the exact same shapes that you're looking at. We live in a tryptamine ecosystem. We have evolved with these tryptamines. They are innate in our very neurophysiology. How do we harness them? Now, you might have different proportionalities in the future, but the natural forms of the mushrooms already have resident within them the proportionalities that we can have demonstrated benefit. The phenotypes of strains preserve these proportionalities, provided their mushrooms are harvested at that one time that I described, one moment where the caps are closed. We published a recent paper, Brent Ettlinger, myself, and our team, Utah State University, showing a tremendous consistency of psilocybin and psilocin content across mushrooms in a single flush. When the mushrooms expand, you get variability. So, a great delivery system, the Aztecs taught us, is chocolate. A friend of mine, when we recently ingested Psilocybe cubensis in Canada, not the United States, DEA, she was shocked that I had the gag response. I go, yeah, these mushrooms are terrible. I just, but you put them in chocolate, I can eat them, right? I think a lot of us have that same experience. So the stack stimulates neurogenesis. Clinical trials are needed. This is a hypothesis. I think it's more than a hypothesis. It's now a theory. Because we have the psychomotor demonstration. We have the MAP kinase data. And it's across more than 100 examples of synergy using different tryptamines and tryptamines in combination. So where do we go from here? This is our time, folks. We're at the threshold of a revolution for the freedom of consciousness. So I want to thank my 10 scientists that work for our company. We have 77 peer-reviewed articles and many more in publication. Lion's mane mycelium is far more potent than 9 lion's mane mushrooms because of production of aranacines that are not produced in the fruit bodies. Note to self. The other thing about the psychomotor test that's so interesting, think about the variables. Think about the confounders. Mushrooms are being bought on the black market. Variability in potency, variability in strains, variability in the lion's mane they're getting, variability in niacin, and yet we have the signal of 0.004. That would suggest the signal is being underestimated. If you standardize this, you could actually maximize psychomotor development and neurogeneration. All of us are carrying the threads of knowledge from our ancestors. All of us owe a deep debt of gratitude to the well-known Maria Sabina, but how many of the unknowns? How many of the unknown shamans and leaders, myconauts, knowledge keepers have been killed, exterminated due to domination, disease, religious persecution? The fact that we are here today is a testimonial to the resiliency of this earth-based knowledge. I challenge all of you, do everything that you can to protect biodiversity. I want to call out to the LGBTQ community. I want to call out to all of you who are outliers. No advancement in science has come typically from conventional wisdom. It's the edge runners. It's the people on the periphery of science, the periphery of culture. These are the change makers. These are the people who have the courage, the strength, the stamina to survive against oppression. So conventional wisdom will always be challenging those of us, like myself, who are edge runners. But my best supporters have been my skeptics. So all of you who are skeptical, even about microdosing, I've come up with a new phrase. I think the majority of us are healthy individuals on the spectrum. We all are in part of the spectrum of differences. But for us to push the envelope of knowledge, we need innovation. And by definition, we need minorities. The strength of our cultures and our ecosystems is based on biodiversity. So all of you, and especially you students, my professors never shamed me. This is important. And you professors who have students, never shame a student. They would tell me privately, Paul, that was a really dumb idea. But they never embarrassed me and humiliated me in public. I gained enormous amounts of respect for them because I knew in their heart and their mind, they were encouraging creativity, inquisitiveness. We are relying upon the younger generation here to push the envelopes of change. Be bold in your creativity. Be bold in your exploration and your imagination. When you journey with psilocybin, think about the solutions that you can bring to bear to solve some of the biggest challenges that we face today. We're all on this earth ship together. We're all indigenous to this planet. It is our diversity that makes us stronger. It is our diversity that will give us our children's future. We can do this together. Thank you very much.